We're going to get started. We appreciate you taking the time to attend our second webinar of our May series. And we certainly hope you and your loved ones are well in these very unusual times. My name is Miriam Ramesh, and I am NLP's Professional Engagement Manager. So I'll just review a couple of things before I pass it over to John. I reviewed the questions in advance. A few of you wanted to know, and we'll repeat this throughout the day. Yes, we are going to record this, and yes, we will make it available. We know how hard it is to juggle watching something and having kids running around or whatever. So to answer those of you that asked that question, yes, it will be made available. We're also going to have a PDF of the slide deck afterwards. And we're going to share lots of other resources as well. If we take a look at our upcoming webinars, next slide. Let's see. Our next one, so we're at May 14th, Fighting Fake, Exploring the Misinformation Landscape. We have two more coming up. They're all on Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We've noticed a lot of you have registered for all of them, which is great. If not, there is still time. So you can go ahead and do that. And we're going to share the link at the end of the presentation as well. And we would love for you all to follow us on social media. Keep up with our news literacy topics. If you do happen to tweet or post anything that really resonated with you today, we would love it if you could use the hashtag NewsLitPD, as you see on here. We're also going to mention the SIFT in our newsletter. We'll talk about that later, as well as our app called Informable. So back to what you're here for. We're going to ask that you guys keep your chats in the chat box, and notice how you have the option to send it to all panelists or panelists and attendees. So if you have, you're chatting with the attendees, make sure you click that setting. For your questions, which we really encourage, make sure you use the Q&A box, right? And just type your comments in there. Yes, there is a recording. And keep the questions coming. We are thrilled to have our entire ed team on deck. So we have Jordan, Peter, and Susanna, as well as myself and John. So some of the questions will be answered live. During the presentation, we have a couple of pauses built in. So you can we can answer a few questions then, and then the rest, we have time set at the end to answer a few more. And I believe, John, this is kicking off to you now.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second of our May News Literacy PD series. Today is going to be about a deep dive into the topic of misinformation and how complicated it can be, but also to discuss some strategies and ways of breaking this down so that you can teach it to your students. So that they can be part of this fighting against fake. For those of you who are not familiar, my name is John Silva. I am part of the education team at the News Literacy Project. I am a former classroom teacher. I taught social studies in Chicago public schools for 13 years before I joined the News Literacy Project. If you are active on social media, that is my Twitter handle there. I do share a lot of ideas and resources and examples about misinformation. I do share a lot, specifically these days, about conspiracy theories, but also with my background in social studies, I do talk a bit about how news literacy can empower civic engagement and using news literacy for students to be more active and informed citizens. So to talk about misinformation, to start off, we need to confront the term fake news. I have noticed that it has been waning in usage, but it is still very much a term that gets thrown around quite often. It used to have a very clear definition, but in the last several years, it has actually become a politicized and weaponized term that is used to sort of dismiss any information that people disagree with. But one of the things we're going to talk about today is that misinformation is very complex, and there's a lot of different things that we need to talk about, and talk about how it is overwhelming, but with some strategies, there are ways that we can mitigate it and push back against it. So I'm going to go through some examples to sort of talk about some of the variations. So for example, you may have seen this video shared recently alleging that Vice President Pence was delivering empty boxes. It was a real video, but most of you may have seen the version that had been edited to make it seem as if Vice President Pence was delivering empty boxes. It's not true. He was actually delivering real boxes, and the audio that you hear was selectively edited with an aide telling him that the remaining boxes were the ones that were empty. So viral videos are one example. Also viral photos. One of the things we're going to talk about is how easy it is to manipulate photos, especially those with t-shirts and signs. So this woman is actually, she is not holding this sign. It's been photoshopped. And this is actually the original sign that she was holding. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you can investigate those. Satire as a form of misinformation. We talked about this in the webinar last week, how satire can be a form of misinformation. Another one are just blatantly false statements. So for example, this tweet saying that Trump had said that hundreds of governors were calling him went viral, and he never said this. And also things like this that are being shared, and we'll talk about how this one in particular, as a hoax, is a different type of misinformation, and some of the things that make it different. So I want to start with a poll question. I know that these were all shared in recent issues of the SIFT, but I'm just kind of curious. I would like to know how many of you, oops, sorry, wrong question. So how many of you have at least seen one or more of these examples in your social media feed in recent weeks? Part of this is just sort of get a sense of how viral some of these images and these things can be. And so far, okay, it looks like only about a third of you haven't seen any of them. I'm going to wait a second to give everyone a chance to weigh in. But the thing is that sometimes these types of misinformation, they go viral and they pop up on your feeds. And you may have noticed them, you may not have. So it looks like about a third of you have seen at least more than one of these. Okay. So you can see here the results. About 40% haven't seen any of them. Okay. So now I'm going to ask another question where I'm going to ask you to be honest. How many of you have actually shared one or more of these? Not knowing that they were false. This is where we're going to, we're not going to call you out individually, but we're interested to know how many of you actually fell for one or more of them. And fortunately, it looks like not too many of you have shared them not knowing they were false. That's actually a really good sign for what you've learned so far, those of you that have been involved in some of our PDs before. So these are very promising resuls. I actually really like to see this. Those of you that feel like you were fooled by it, one of the things we're going to talk about are some of the things to look for, so that you can practice some good news literacy habits yourself, but also how to teach some of these with your students. Okay, so we need to get rid of the term fake news. That's an important first step that we have to acknowledge. That it's an overused term, it's a weaponized term. But obviously, if we're going to get rid of a term, we have to replace it with things that are more accurate. So we're going to talk about a new vocabulary for misinformation. How we can talk about this and break it down and make it clear learning objectives and things for students. But one of the most important things that I want to emphasize, especially for those of you who are involved in civics education, is that debunking misinformation and fighting back against misinformation is very much a 21st century civic action. being a good digital citizen and, pushing back against misinformation, fighting for verified factual information. These are all things that we really want to empower our students to be able to do. And that's actually one of the key objectives for this webinar to think about. So I want to talk about give you just an overview of how we're going to break this down. I want to talk about, those types. How do we define different types of misinformation? We want to understand a little bit about why people share misinformation or even create it. Because understanding the motivations behind it is an important aspect of understanding misinformation and how it goes viral. I'm going to talk again about the role of emotion. I mentioned it last week in the What Does It Mean to Be News Literate webinar, but understanding emotions is a critical part of this. And then I'm going to talk about some strategies for how we can be part of the effort to debunk misinformation in a way that hopefully will result in people understanding misinformation and maybe not being as eager to share it. Okay, so let's break down these different types. How do we define misinformation in terms of the different ways that it appears? Dr. Claire Wardle at First Draft and her team have come up with what they call are the 7 types of mis and disinformation, and they have done a lot of great work in this field in helping to break it down. At the News Literacy Project, in our resources, we've actually simplified this to 5 key types. And I'm going to talk about each of these examples. One of the things you may know is that we have a lesson specifically about these 5 types of misinformation in the Checkology virtual classroom. And Dr. Wardle is actually our subject matter expert in this lesson, guiding students through how to identify and understand these 5 types. So going to this image where with the Photoshop sign, we call this manipulated content. So basically it's a real image, but one aspect of it has been changed. So one tip that we like to share is that you should always be wary of t-shirts and signs because they are those are the ones that are most easily manipulated. And from our word wall in Checkology, here's how we define it. So it's one aspect of a piece of misinformation has been altered to create a new piece of misinformation, usually through some sort of photo editing tools. Going back to the example of Vice President Pence, is what we call false context. By changing some of the details about the piece of misinformation that's being shared, we create a new kind of misinformation. So changing the context is also a very common. And manipulated content and false context are probably 2 of the most common types of misinformation that we see out there. And so here's the definition from the word wall. So you can change a quote, you can change an image, you can change the details, changing something about it to make it seem like it's something completely different. A third is fabricated content. This is where the whole thing has been made up. So this is a made up quote that's been attributed to President Trump falsely. So something that is completely made up is fabricated. Sometimes we see something where an entire image has been created using computer graphics. Sometimes it's just something that's blatantly false. But fabricated is a key type. Related to this in some ways is what we call imposter content. So this fake tweet, so this is not a real tweet from President Trump, but this tweet went viral after the comedian Chelsea Handler shared it on her Facebook page and on Twitter. And so this is a fake tweet that is alleging to be from the president. So imposter content is where you use a well-known or a famous name or a company or a logo to make people believe something is authentic when it actually isn't. So you see this with like fake tweets. Sometimes you see this with fake quotes. So there are some subtle differences between the 2, but it's really about making it seem like it's from someone that's authentic when it's not. And then we've talked about satire before as a type of misinformation. It is its unique type, and sometimes there is some disagreement about whether or not it is misinformation. Sometimes we have to think about it in terms of intent. But understanding that satire is misinformation in its own way as part of these 5 types is an important thing to teach. And it's really about humor. It's about hyperbole and exaggeration. Sometimes it can be considered, a type of sharing of opinions. But an important thing about satire is that sometimes when someone puts out misinformation and there's pushback, they'll often claim satire as a defense against sharing something that was false. And so it's important to realize how these are different, because it gets to some of the reasons behind motivations that I'll talk about in a minute, and really about some of the methodologies that are being used. So I'm going to pause here for a second about the 5 types. I'm going to ask Miriam to take a look at the Q&A and see if there's any questions about the 5 types of misinformation and the differentiation before we move on.
All right, we do have a couple of questions regarding the memes at the start of the presentation. Jill is saying her students share these and they know they're fake, but they think they're funny. Any advice or suggestions on how to handle that?
I think the interesting way of framing that with students is that when they're sharing it, even if they're sharing it knowing that it's false because they think it's funny, they're actually contributing to the viral nature of the misinformation, and they're spreading it and making it reach more people. And the more people this misinformation reaches, the harder it is often to be able to verify that it's not true. And they're sort of unwittingly contributing to the problem. And that's one of the things that we want them to understand, is that we want to shift from, instead of sharing it because you think it's funny and you want to have a laugh about it, instead we want to shift their mindset that actually you want to push back against this and sort of help reduce the misinformation pollution rather than making it worse.
Great. All right, so we have a question. Where are students encountering misinformation the most? This is from Jenny. And what social media platform, because what they use is different than what adults use.
It is, but one of the things we have to recognize is that this misinformation shows up across all social media platforms. It just comes in different forms. Students that are on TikTok are actually encountering a lot of viral misinformation in the form of videos or images that have been turned into videos and being shared on TikTok. Kids also share it through their group messaging apps. You would find it on Snapchat or WhatsApp. But they may also encounter it if they're on Facebook. Students are probably not on Facebook and Twitter as much, but they're encountering it in those places as well. But the important thing is that it's really not the platform that's the priority. It's really about understanding what to do when you encounter misinformation on any platform.
Okay, lots of questions coming in. If we don't get to them, folks, we do have time again later. We have 2 requests to take a peek at the slides, the 7 types of misinformation from first draft, and then our simplified version. If you could pop that back up.
So the thing about the 7 types
why we simplified it.
Okay. So one of the reasons why we simplified this is that if you look at the 7 types that first draft put together, intent is a key part of how they define these different types. So if you look at satire and parody, it says there's no intention to cause harm. But intent, as I'll talk about in a couple minutes, is a very tricky thing to be able to measure objectively. And intent can be different for the people who create a piece of misinformation and the people who share it. So I would say that sometimes when people are publishing satire or parody, yes, they are trying to be funny because that's a key aspect of it. But in some ways, they are also trying to fool us. And they may be trying to make a very strong political point with their satire, because a lot of satire today is political. And so because intent is such a difficult thing to judge, and there are so many variables, we simplified it to these 5 types so to create this idea that looking at only how they're created, not necessarily why they're created or how they're shared. It's really about understanding the different ways that misinformation appears. So like manipulated content is different than something that's totally fabricated. So we really wanted to get to a more objective, simplified way of explaining these 5 types so that when students can look at them, they can see what it is. Then we move into questions of intent and motivations.
Brief question I'm going to answer. Cheryl, how do you tell an image has been doctored? We're going to get to that in a little bit. So
yes.
Stay. Yeah, lots more questions, but
okay, we're gonna move on. We'll have a longer Q&A at the end. We'll get back to some of these questions, and my colleagues Peter and Susanna will be trying to answer some of them in the Q&A boxes as well. Okay, let's talk about some of those motivations. And a little bit of this does get into intent. So it's the 2 motivations are why people share and why people create. And so questions of intent are very difficult because sometimes we can't always know why someone has shared something or why someone has created something. And there are intent is different between those 2 groups. What we want to recognize though is that one of the motivations is that they are trying to use our emotions in particular and the different types of emotions that are used. But if we can get into some discussions about intent, we can actually get to a deeper understanding of how misinformation is created and shared and why it goes viral and why people are willing to share it and believe it. So there are some basic motivations that we can sort of explain. Some people create misinformation as a way of generating traffic to a website to generate ad revenue. Sometimes it's about content that's published on a satire website for the same thing. Some people are just trying to cause trouble. They're just trying to stir things up just as a way of maybe being funny and drawing attention to something. A lot of misinformation is very partisan and very political. We see a lot of this in terms of currently in our current election cycle. We saw a great deal of this in 2016, but also in the midterms and as an ongoing effort. And one of the things that we also want to emphasize, this is a global problem. But one of the key things that we want to talk about in the United States with our students is that there are a lot of outside forces who are trying to influence our political processes and disrupt our discourse and with these important political and social issues. And in a lot of ways, when we allow this misinformation to cause all these problems, it does undermine our democracy because we're not making our decisions based from informed viewpoints. We're being manipulated with misinformation. And then getting into some of the reasons, so propagation goals, we're going to talk about these 4 types, and then some of these emotional reactions. So these get into why people share it and spread it. So let's talk about some 4 key types. So I'm going to show some examples of these 4 key types, but when we talk about why people are sharing it, why people are helping it to go viral, we can break it down into 4 basic motivations this way. But again, with a lot of these things, it's not always that easy to categorize because sometimes different people will share things for different reasons. So self-interest, people who create and share some of this are for clear self-interest. So, for example, creating satire is in the interest of the people who create the satire and share it. Someone who shares this though may not recognize that it's satire, but they're sharing it because they have this narrow self-interest about the issue of whether or not we should be wearing masks in public. And so that's part of a motivation there. Group interest is sort of the larger political beliefs. So someone is sharing this because they're trying to influence a larger political viewpoint and sharing it for those same reasons. So this is a bit about that partisan nature of misinformation. And some people are sharing it because they're trying to damage the reputation of someone on the other side of the political spectrum, or they're sharing it to sort of say, look, this is what the other side is saying about our particular viewpoint or positions. But some people actually will share things because they think that they're sharing something useful. So for example, this false claim that you can microwave your face masks, someone might see this and think, oh, this is actually a really helpful tip. I have to share this with my friends because we need to make sure our masks are clean. So understanding this as an altruistic motivation is something that's a little different and one that we don't always think about. But I do actually have to caution, please do not microwave your face masks. This is one of those consequences of misinformation that people see this, and then they go try it, and now fire departments across the country have to issue these warnings saying, please don't microwave your mask, it's actually very dangerous. But some misinformation can be very malicious, right? It is intentionally trying to cause harm. It's intentionally trying to influence things because they are trying to make someone, in this case, look worse, right? She is protesting here, but they changed the sign, and it's really sort of a very malicious edit to this. So this has some questions that I want to share with you, some ways that you might discuss these with your students as some group discussions to get to a better understanding. So we can talk about intent. And so asking some ways that we can try to determine intent objectively, especially with why people share it or why people create it. So talking about the difference between something that's satirical, whereas somebody photoshopped a sign, having some questions about intent, and really getting an understanding that it's difficult. You can't always judge it objectively, but there are some ways that we can try to measure it, and having a discussion about that can be a really engaging conversation with students. Accountability is also another important aspect. So the person who created this false rumor, it reminds me of when, every once in a while a new iPhone or iOS update comes out, and people will share a hoax that you can recharge your phone by putting it in the microwave. This is a bit of maybe a little mischief or malicious in the person who created this rumor. But the question is, what about the people who share it? Do we hold them accountable for sharing misinformation without checking it out first? Are they making the problem worse? So questions of accountability can be really interesting discussions. So what do we do about this, and how do we push back? Another one that's related to this, though, is that sometimes an image may be shared out of context. So, for example, this is an image from a digital artist who shares her work on Instagram. So she created this image, and she puts it out there as art. It's digital art. But what about people who take that and put it into false context misinformation, and then it goes viral? So there's some questions of accountability, like people who misuse artwork or things that other people create for the purpose of creating misinformation. You can imagine that the person who originally created this as art probably got some negative feedback when people were fooled, thinking that it was something that was real because it had been put into a piece of false context misinformation. And then getting to consequences. We have to realize that misinformation can have very important real world consequences. So this woman who went viral showing a sign that she actually wasn't holding, she probably received a lot of very negative feedback for this image, but she had nothing to do with the manipulated image. But there's also other consequences that we could talk about in terms of like the dangers of sharing misinformation. And so what should some of these consequences be? And that could be a good conversation to have with students as well. So I want to go back into emotions. I mentioned this a little bit last time, but I want to talk a bit more about it because manipulating our emotions is an important aspect of how misinformation is spread. Because when we have a strong emotional reaction, our rational thought processes are kind of overridden. And what the people who create misinformation are hoping that we do is that we react and share something from that emotional response without actually taking the time to think about it first. And the important thing that we always have to remember is that our teens, adolescents are very vulnerable to this because we have to remember about adolescent brain development. The executive functions of the brain, the rational centers and the judgment are the last parts of the brain to develop. And so in those preteen and teen years, those executive functions and the rational centers of the brains are only beginning to develop. So they're using more of the emotion centers. And so that is what makes them especially vulnerable. And we also have to remember that these emotions can cover a range. You know, satire, we might find something is really, really funny and share it, not realizing that it's satire. And so understanding these different emotional responses and how emotional responses play into this is a really important thing to recognize with students and to teach them, because they don't want to be manipulated. They don't want to be fooled because their emotions were used against them. So understanding those emotional responses is really important. So I'm just going to, remind these four main types. With the self-interest, you see this a lot with companies that will share things like satire, but also people will create it just for the idea of generating clicks and generating revenue. People who are trying to spread scams and whatnot. A lot of misinformation comes from these hyper-partisan groups, but it can sometimes come from governments and political candidates. Anybody could share something that more altruistically, but the malicious ones that we also have to really be careful of are the trolls, the people who are trying to deliberately cause problems with misinformation, people who are sharing the most extreme views and especially with conspiracy theories. So I'm going to pause again here for questions about some of these propagators and emotions. Miriam, what have we got?
Here we go. A question we have is it important for students to be able to identify the different types of misinformation?
I think yes, it is in general, because part of what it gets to is if you can identify the type, that does help get to some questions about intent and motivations. But it's also going to be key for, if you can understand the type, you also understand some of the digital verification tools that you would want to use to investigate it. So if you see a manipulated image, you would want to use a reverse image search. If you see a fake quote, you might use some lateral reading, which I'll go over those different types of verification tools in a minute. But the way you investigate it and the way you try to understand it, you follow some different threads based on the different types.
All right, and another question is a good lead-in. Since teens are so emotionally responsive, how do we keep them focused on the concept of misinformation without getting derailed by their reactions to the examples we use to demonstrate misinformation?
Yeah, that's a kind of a tricky one. I think part of it is when we start talking about misinformation, we can kind of do like what I did at the beginning, is show some examples and just have a discussion. Like, so when you see this, what's your emotional reaction? And when they start thinking about that, by pausing to think about the emotional reaction, what you're actually doing is engaging the rational part of your brain to do sort of a bit of a meta thinking. Like, so, okay, so what is my emotional reaction? Why am I having it? So what about this example is causing that? By doing that, you're actually pushing down the emotion and engaging the rational parts of your brain. Then you can go into a deeper discussion from there.
Great. When teaching students about misinformation, should we tell students to just not spread, or should we also teach them ways to actively debunk misinformation? This is from Shay, who teaches 8th and 9th graders.
So I think that depends largely on the grade level and maturity of your students in some ways, but also how comfortable you feel teaching them about how they can engage with misinformation in the real world. I think with younger students, like with middle schoolers, I would be cautious about having them engage with misinformation in the general public. But you would definitely want to teach them, because I think they can start by debunking misinformation that is shared by friends and family. Keep it sort of in a closed environment that way, that like when someone shares this, you know that person, here's how you can debunk it with them. And then as they get more comfortable with those skills and the practice, then they may sort of branch out and engage with misinformation in sort of the wider world of social media. But again, I think that's really a judgment call for each teacher to think about the maturity level and how comfortable you feel like your students would be to do that. But hopefully if you teach them these things, eventually they'll do it on their own.
Great. One more here from another one from Jennifer. You touch a little on dividing citizens. How do you convince people to look through that lens without being thought a conspiracy theorist?
That's a tricky question, because a lot of misinformation does have some aspect of conspiratorial thinking sometimes, especially with the most extreme political views. Not always, and it's not one side or the other. Both sides engage in hyper-partisan misinformation in different ways. I think the way we approach this is by starting with, when we're talking about our politics and our government and our social policies and the things that we want government to be doing for us, that we want to prioritize the things that we know are true, the things that are factual, the things that are based on facts and evidence, not the things that are about emotions and name calling and spreading.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me? Great.
Peter?
Hi. Hi, Sarah.
Okay, Peter.
Okay, so it's very tricky. So I think that it's just a way of thinking about, we want to get to the part where we stop arguing and we get more to discourse. I've talked about the difference between discourse and argument before. The thing we want to prioritize, especially from a civics perspective and a news literacy's perspective, is that discourse is a sharing of ideas and viewpoints. It's not about trying to shout the other side down. It's about using evidence over emotion and falsehoods. And so I think that when we talk about those priorities, I think if the other side is open to having that type of discourse, that's how you can approach it. But you always have to be careful that, people have these very strongly held beliefs and they may not be willing to engage in those conversations.
All right. Do you want another one, or shall we?
Let's do one more if there's one that's really relevant to the last section.
Let's see. What grade do you think we should start teaching these concepts in?
That's a great question. So news literacy in general, based on some of the research that I've done, we talk about news literacy broadly with some of the basic concepts. You can start as young as 3rd or 4th grade. But I think when we start getting into the more advanced things with misinformation, different types of misinformation, I would wait until middle school. I think middle school students can handle some of these more in-depth discussions and some of the nuances of things like intent and motivations. And by middle school, more and more kids at that age are getting phones and are engaging in social media. So I think, that's a good age, because that's when they're going to start encountering it. They're going to be on TikTok and they're going to see a conspiracy theory video or a piece of misinformation. And so that's when we need to start thinking about talking about some of these concepts earlier. Okay, let's continue. So how do we debunk misinformation? How do we push back? So some of these are some skills that I'm hoping each of you will try to practice, because this is a huge group effort in terms of fighting misinformation. But I want to talk about the strategies of how you do it the right way. So we start with some essential fact-checking skills. I've talked about these before, but I'm going to show you again. So one of the first skills, I didn't mention this last time, but is just simple observation skills. So for example, you see this image with the Photoshop sign, right? If you share this without really thinking about it or evaluating it, you're going to share misinformation. But one of the things you want to do is look closely, especially T-shirts and signs. You want to look very closely. So if you look really closely at this image, and if you zoom in a little bit, you actually can see that there is a sign in the image that has been manipulated. You can see here, I've zoomed in on it, her fingers are at a very weird angle. The O is not complete. Sometimes you'll see subtle things in looking at letters, looking at edges and shading. So looking for those visual cues can help you, can say, hey, that doesn't look right. This isn't real. So with an image, you might then do a reverse image search to verify that it's been manipulated. So the way you do this is to right click on the image and click search. It says search. This says search Google for image, but whatever browser you're using, they all have this feature. And you can see from the results, In this case, you have to, evaluate the results. Don't just click on the first one. We talk about this as click restraint. So you'll see here the first results that pop up are actually fact-checking sites that are talking about this being an altered image. But if you scroll down, one of the things you have to be careful of is that you actually may find results of the manipulated image where people are sharing it. And so you have to be very careful about what sources you look at to sort of figure out if the image is real or not, because you may just end up reinforcing and believing that it is real when it's been manipulated. You can also engage in some lateral reading if you don't want to do a reverse image search. So in this case, I just Googled the content of the sign, Barack Hussein Obama COVID-19 sign, and I come up with the same results. And I can see that I have several fact checks that come up. So the thing that we want to emphasize with students when we're doing a reverse image search or with lateral reading is that you need to do the search in a deliberate way. You want to be very careful about what tools you use, what terms you put into the search box. If I'm going to investigate a quote, I'm going to put the quote in quotation marks and Google that. Investigate key details. Click restraint is really important. Look at all the results that are in the search results and review them before you start choosing which ones that you're going to look into further. And choose those results that you think would be most relevant. And keep going and evaluating the information. Look at the sources critically and keep going until you're confident you have an answer. Either, yes, I know that this is not true, or actually it is true, it's real. But you have to keep going. I'm going to mention here that this is adapted from Stanford History Education Group's Civic Online Reasoning. These are some questions that we want students to remember when we're doing this digital verification and fact checking, is that we have to be very careful about not just the posts, but also the results that we get in our search. Who's the source? What's the credibility of that source? Is there evidence? What's the credibility of that evidence? Is there a connection? And so these are questions that go through. And if you go to the source and you realize that you might find out, oh, that's satire. Okay, so I now know that this is a satirical claim. Or you may find it's a hyper-partisan website. So each of these, it's kind of a pass-fail. If you investigate the credibility of the source and the source seems credible, then you can look at the evidence. If the evidence seems credible, then you can look at the connections. So this is almost like a flow chart that you can use with students in terms of how they evaluate the information. Next week, my colleague Peter Adams is going to be doing a webinar specifically about digital verification. He's going to go into a lot more detail with these digital verification skills and tools. He's going to talk about some more advanced tools that you can use, such as using mapping and geolocation tools, web archivers, and a number of other things. So if you really want to get into some of the deeper details about digital verification, Peter's session is next week, and registration is still open for that one. Okay, getting into debunking. So once you have evidence and you verified that it's a piece of misinformation, how do you debunk it? So I'm going to go back to this one. How do we push back against this if somebody shares this with us, now knowing that it's not real? The most important thing we have to remember is that we need to avoid being confrontational. Because if we're confrontational, that can elicit what's called the backfire effect. If our beliefs are challenged too strongly, we may actually, instead of being open to being wrong, we may actually hold on to that belief a little bit more strongly. So we want to avoid ways of pushing back that makes that person feel foolish. We don't want to criticize them. We don't want to call them names. We don't want to lecture them either. We don't want to say, hey, that's not true. Here's why that's not true. We don't want to go through that. What we want to do is approach it from a position of empathy, because that person may not know it's real. So we need to present information in a way that makes them open to recognizing that they were manipulated, and find a way to share the evidence with them so that they can see it for themselves. But as always, we have to go into this with low expectations, and we have to be willing to step back if the person is not open to a fact check, if they're not open to a debunking. We don't want to fight it. We don't want to keep pushing, because that's just not going to be a good experience for anyone. So one way that you can do is you say approach with caution and just share a piece of evidence. So this is an example of how you might respond to that image. Hey, I'm skeptical. There's something about that doesn't look right. It looks like it might be Photoshopped. I found this other image that has something different. I want to show it to you. What do you think? So you're showing some empathy. You're raising this idea of some skepticism, and then you're sharing the new evidence with them, but showing it to them so they can see for themselves. That's a more open way of approaching this, so that they can see, and then maybe they're more open to saying, "Oh man, I was fooled by that one." It gives them an out in a lot of ways, because when we're wrong, we don't want to always just straight up admit we were wrong. It's easier to say, "Oh man, I got fooled by that one. I was manipulated. I didn't realize." Thank you for setting it straight. Another way is getting them to sort of think about where they got the information from. So, hey, where did you get that? I'm really cautious about this stuff. There's so much bad information out there, especially how strong things are with COVID-19 and the pandemic. There's so much bad information. Make them question the source themselves. And then, maybe they will engage in some thinking, and then maybe you could also introduce some evidence like, oh, hey, I look more into that. I think they might have Photoshopped that, and give them a way to sort of think about that for themselves. Okay, so I'm going to go into a resource we're going to share with you called How to Know What to Trust. This is a kind of a flow chart that you can share with students as a way of sort of bringing all of this together. So the first, we talk about emotions, have that pause, and then think about, okay, what's the emotion and where is this information from? Is this something that a user created? Is this from a source that I don't know? Is this unfamiliar to me? Or is this actually from a news source? Do I recognize this as being a reputable source? And in each of those three categories, we have some questions that students can sort of next step. And all these, with these two slides, these two processes can take about a minute, maybe two. So one of the things that we sort of say is like, you can debunk misinformation in less than 2 minutes, in less than the amount of time you're supposed to wash your hands every day. But here are some ways that you can do this. So this is actually a PDF that we have on our website. Here is the link where you can download the PDF yourself to share with students, and it goes into some more detail with some further steps. We've also shared this PDF in the shared resource folder, and I'm going to give you a link to that in just a minute. And as always, one of the things we always want to do as educators and as parents is to model these behaviors ourselves. The more that we can do this and model this for others, the more other people are going to be willing to sort of engage in these steps to help fight back against misinformation. So don't just make this something you do with your students. Model this for your friends and family on your own social media feeds, and find ways of practicing this yourself. And then by doing that, other people will sort of see those methods, and then they can actually join up and help stand up for the facts. I went through quite a lot here about these sort of steps and these different objectives. I think these are some really key questions that you can frame this in terms of how you approach this with your students in terms of essential questions. And again, all these slides are going to be available in a PDF in the shared resource folder. So I'm going to pause here, and we're going to go into one final Q&A. And we'll wrap up, and I'll share some additional resources with you.
All right, Q&A. All right, a question from Christine. How do you feel about having students create their own forms of satire, propaganda, etc., in the context of an educational setting? In other words, as part of a study or novel, for example.
I'm going to try not to be too flip with this, but generally we say that is not a very good idea. The analogy that we like to use is that you wouldn't teach students about pollution by taking them down to put chemicals in the river. The misinformation environment is already polluted enough as it is, and even if you're doing it in a closed environment or a classroom, you can't always control if a student might decide that they're going to share it out there trying to see what happens. So we don't want them creating their own misinformation, because you can't always control what happens if it gets out into the wild. And then that affects them, and that can affect their reputation, because then all of a sudden if they fool people, then they've become, their reputation as a source of information is called into question. And it's just generally something that we discourage from doing in an academic setting.
Okay. How will I know if the info is true when it's shared, when it is by a news site?
So I think that generally that goes into your own judgment about the source of news. If it is a piece of news as opposed to an opinion piece, the evidence should be apparent in that news article. The standards of quality journalism, journalists will verify the information. They will tell you how they verified it and the sources that they used. But again, if you're skeptical, if there's something in there that doesn't sound right, then engage in some lateral reading. See if other news organizations are reporting the same thing. Because news organizations, they do get it wrong sometimes, especially in breaking news events. So part of that is verifying information from ourselves. And if we find that only one organization is sharing a piece of information and nobody else is, that's when we have to kind of go a little deeper. But again, part of it is about observation. Part of it is about kind of trusting our own instincts if we think something might not be true, and then doing the verification for ourselves, and then push back. News organizations get it wrong, and if they do, if it's a reputable organization, they should issue a correction.
Great. Okay, so this question overlaps a couple of things because it has to do with verification. Somebody else is asking about, but Amy would like a definition for what exactly is lateral reading.
Lateral reading is a deliberate search. I think that's one of the simplest ways of putting it. So it's not just about Googling something randomly. It's really about thinking about what search tools are most effective. So the first step is actually, instead of staying on a source that you want to investigate, it's opening up a new browser tab and going into a search engine. And then it's about a deliberate search. So thinking about things like putting search terms in quotation marks to match an exact phrase or sentence. You can use a plus or a minus sign to require or exclude a term. So if you put a minus sign in front of a term, the search engine will ignore results that have that term. But it's also about critically evaluating the results. It's about looking at the search results, exercising click restraint, and then thinking about how deep do I need to go to be able to verify this information. But the key thing is, it's about getting off of the source, doing an independent search, and doing it in a deliberate way.
Okay. Teaching skepticism could be significant. Good ideas for doing so?
I think I would start with a discussion about the difference between being skeptical and being cynical, because sometimes the people can conflate those. I think that there's a way of talking about skepticism as a way of recognizing that you're not entirely sure, but being willing to find a way to be sure. Because sometimes skepticism goes too far to the point where you're skeptical, but you're skeptical to the point where you don't trust anything. So teaching about skepticism as a way of investigating information because you want to be satisfied with the answer, and you keep going with those verification tools and whatnot until you are satisfied, until that skepticism is satisfied. So I think that's an important way of looking at it.
All right. How do you deal with confirmation bias where people seek support for what they believe?
Yeah, confirmation bias and motivated reasoning is a part of why misinformation does spread, because when you are in a closed environment, like if you're in a Facebook group, or if you only follow social media accounts that share similar views, you're going to see misinformation that supports some of those viewpoints, but it's very difficult sometimes to challenge those because, if it reinforces something that you believe really strongly, it's going to be harder to override your emotional reaction. And so recognizing what confirmation bias is and how it does play into this in some ways is important. And, we'll talk more about bias in 2 weeks. When we do a deep dive into bias. That'll be the last session 2 weeks from today. We'll talk more about bias in that session in general. But yeah, it is something to recognize, but but primarily from the sense that it makes it harder to debunk misinformation when you're only getting it from a certain perspective.
All right, there are a lot of questions. Thank you, everybody, for keeping them.
Let's do one more so I can go through the resources, and then I'll just stay on and answer and keep answering questions as best we can. We can go over time, but we'll do that.
All right, so here is, I pushed back against a friend on Facebook the other day who posted a false quote article. Then I realized that it might be dangerous, not from him, but from some of the other quote friends. So I deactivated my account for a while. How to handle the possibility of fostering violence?
Yeah, I mean, part of that is directly tied to how you debunk, right? You know, you don't want to do it in a way that invites confrontation, because, you know, when we're talking about especially very strong political beliefs, but sometimes when we're also talking about conspiracy theories, people have these beliefs so strongly to the point that they actually become part of their identity. And you have to approach that with caution. So I think that finding a way to approach debunking from a way of, you know, questioning, trying to use empathy, but also just recognizing that sometimes you may not want to debunk something depending on where you find it. Like if you find something in a closed Facebook group and it strongly reinforces the general belief of that group, you may not want to push back against it. And then you might want to question whether or not you stay in that group. But trying to avoid confrontation, trying to avoid name calling, and trying to share evidence and information in a way that invites scrutiny and is open as a question is probably a good way of doing it. But yeah, you have to recognize that you're not always going to be successful, and you may just need to walk away. All right, I'm going to share some resources very quickly. So here is the link to our shared resource folder. We do have information from the previous webinar in this folder. We're putting all resources from all 4 webinars in this one folder, so we will be updating it continually over the next couple of weeks. So please share this. We will send this to you in a follow-up email, so you'll be able to see this. Again, if you're not using the Checkology Virtual Classroom, we have dropped the paywall for this year, so teachers can request free licenses for their students. I know that it's a struggle right now with everyone doing remote learning, but if you want a good way of bringing this to your students, you know, using the Checkology Virtual Classroom is a good starting point. Also, First Draft. I referenced them earlier and the work of Dr. Wardle and her team. They've done a lot of good work in understanding misinformation, and they do have a lot of great information. It is geared mainly towards the general public, but they do have some education resources, and I think that they've got some great stuff that you can use with your students as well. I want to mention On the Media's Breaking News Consumers Handbook. Breaking news is a time when misinformation is rampant and very difficult to sort through. So this is what they call their fake news edition. I wish they changed that. But they have a number of these consumer handbooks on different topics. But it does offer a good checklist that you can use. We have a copy of this in the shared resource folder. The SIFT is about to go on summer break. We have one more issue of the SIFT coming out on Monday. It is our newsletter where we share real-time teachable moments in terms of misinformation and how to bring this to your students. If you go to newslit.org/educators/the SIFT, you can see the archives of all of the issues that have been put out. It is the incredible hard work of Peter and Susanna putting that out every week. And people find it very useful and informative. So if you're not a subscriber, we'll include a link to subscribe in our follow-up email. Our app, Informable, while it doesn't directly address misinformation, it is a really valuable app that you can use for talking about different types of things. The one mode in particular that is relevant to this is evidence or not, whether or not a post provides evidence to support a claim. But also checkable or not is a good mode here, learning to recognize things that you can check for yourself or not. Also, we do in-person professional development. We're hoping to be able to restart these in the new school year. A Newslit Camp is a really engaging day of professional development where we bring educators together with journalists from a local news organization. We spend the day usually at that newsroom talking about news literacy, talking about journalism, and really engaging in some really meaningful conversations between educators and journalists. If you think your school district might be interested in a Newslit camp, there is a link there that you can go to, and you can reach out to Miriam and myself, and we can sort of start looking to see if we might be able to bring in a free Newslit camp to your district and your town. So one more time, so there's 2 more sessions. At the bottom is the link to our registration page. If you are not registered for the 2 webinars that are coming up, here's your opportunity where you can register for them. We'll include the link to register in the follow-up email as well. Peter is going to be leading both of these, doing a real deep dive into advanced digital forensic skills and how to teach these to students, including with some engaging classroom activities that you can do. And then going into the topic of bias, which is an incredibly complex topic, but a very important one to work with your students. So as I sort of end, and I'm going to go into last Q&A, we value your feedback tremendously. We ask that you please take this survey. It is also case sensitive, like all Bitleys. It is a short survey where we would like your feedback for how effective and informative you found this webinar to be. We gather this after every PD that we do, and we get your comments and suggestions, and it helps us improve our offerings because at the education team here at the News Literacy Project, being able to provide quality, relevant, professional development is a huge priority for us. We know that news literacy can be a complex topic to try to bring to your classes. So we want to find ways to make these meaningful, to make these engaging. So your feedback is greatly appreciated and incredibly important to us. So please take a moment to complete that survey. So it is a little after 2. I'm going to stay on for a little while and try to answer some more questions. But thank you for joining us today. If you have to go, we will send a link to the recording when we send our follow-up email. Hopefully we'll be able to send it out tomorrow. So if you have to drop off, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, and thank you for everything that you're doing in these very difficult times, and hopefully bringing news literacy to your students.
Great. All right, so up for more questions, John.
Yes, let's do it.
Here we go. Question from Lindsay. To me, I think one of the most important skills to share with students is to check their sources. So many students who do historical research for me go to websites without considering who is creating it. Similarly, one of the things that frustrates me the most about social media is people who are sharing things they never bothered to check its source. Rather than teach students to spot photoshopping, isn't it a better tactic to constantly reinforce students' need to determine who is the creator and why are they creating it? And if this is the most essential skill, how do we make sure students are constantly doing it?
It is an incredibly important skill. And it is often a really important way of recognizing that something is misinformation or false in some way. Some teachers use checklists for investigating, evaluating a source. And that's where sort of lateral reading comes into play really importantly. So I'll use the example. There's a website called the Great Pacific Northwest Tree Octopus. And if you follow a checklist, you stay on that website, and it has you go through a number of things. And it can be difficult using a checklist to determine that that's not a real website. It's designed by some teachers actually to teach about evaluating sources. But if you open up a new browser tab and you engage in some lateral reading and you just search Great Pacific Northwest Tree Octopus, you find very quickly that it's not true. So engaging in lateral reading and searching for the source, it can be an important step. And it's just one of those things, I think, that it's about repetition with students. Having them do it, reinforcing how important it is, finding some way of having them include how they verified the source in the work that they do can be an effective strategy. But it's really about teaching them how, and then, through repetition, having them do it continually. And then they can do the same thing when they are doing some of their regular academic work and academic research. Verifying the validity and credibility of a source is important. But it really just kind of depends, because if you're just trying to debunk something, doing a reverse image search can debunk it fairly quickly, or you can go to the source. But sometimes you may find the source is just an ordinary person who shared something, and it doesn't really tell you much. So that's why we sort of emphasize some of the different methods, and it's not about one or the other, it's about a process.
Anne has a question, and also a couple of other people asked about how do we do this from our phones, because that's what you're on the most, or that's what the kids are on the most. So I sent a link. There's a Medium article that talks about how to do a reverse image search from your phone.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another one that Jordan found, think like a fact checker. So we'll add that to the question. But if you want to speak more to that.
Yeah, so there are reverse image search apps that you can use. I have one on my phone that actually searches 3 different image databases. So it can be a matter of taking a screenshot of something or downloading an image. So there are apps that can do reverse image search. You can do lateral reading from the browser of your phone. So it could be if you see for example, a text claim or the name of a source, you can highlight it and copy it and then paste it into a search on your phone browser. It is a little more complicated, because toggling back and forth between apps on your phone can be a little annoying, a little time consuming, but the strategies are effectively the same. But finding some apps on your phone can actually be really useful. One of the other good things to look for, I didn't necessarily mention this, but some social media platforms are getting better at flagging misinformation. So I've seen people have shared Facebook posts and there'll be an overlay that says, hey, this has been shown to be false. So there are some of those, but we will share some additional resources in the resource folder. But the basic answer is that some of the skills are the same, but there are some apps that can make it easier.
Okay, this is scrolling through. Okay, somebody is sharing that they did something similar in their class about creating fake news, but they flipped it. Instead, it was the educator that fabricated the headline.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a folder of data, charts, graphics, quotes, and then the kids had to prove or disprove the headlines using the evidence. They basically had to go through the motions of fixing the disproven headlines. Would that be a better?
I think that can be, especially if the teacher can keep it in a controlled environment. The danger is you can't always control what people might do with it. I think using it as a strategy of investigating things, I think, can be effective. You can use real world examples. So you could use examples from the SIFT for doing a similar thing, sharing some of those with students and having them debunk it. It's a very tricky thing because, we don't want to contribute to the spread of misinformation. I think if the teacher does create it themselves, that could be a more effective way, but I would caution against, making those more widely available and just being careful with it.
Great. Do you have any precautionary advice when discussing hard copy sources versus electronic sources websites?
So if you're talking about a book that someone is reading, there are ways that you can, looking into a book, you can sort of see who the author is, who published it. There are some of those things that you can do, but you can still engage in some lateral reading to investigate a book. Because it is actually really easy to self-publish things today. And even if you may have maybe not a hard copy book, but you might have an ebook that someone has self-published. And there's a lot of this on Amazon right now. There are self-published books on conspiracy theories and other things like that. So engaging in some lateral reading for checking that out as well. Google the author, Google the publisher, Google some of the details. It's a very similar thing, but also if you're talking about research, if we're talking maybe a nonfiction book that someone has written about something in history, you can still do the same thing and investigate those sources that way as well.
Oops. All right. Unmuted. Question from Jenny. What do you do with students who don't believe any news sources, that legitimate publications are liberal, quote, fake news?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult issue because there is so much cynicism out there in general, and a lot of adolescents can be cynical themselves. I think I would start with a discussion with students about what it would take for them to believe something. Having a conversation about what would be evidence that they would be willing to trust, what would be a source that they would be willing to trust that evidence from, and having a question about that, and then getting back into that discussion about the difference between cynicism and skepticism. Right, the skeptic is doubtful but is willing to accept when something has been proven true. The cynic doesn't trust anything. And so having a discussion about the differences between skepticism and cynicism, and sort of getting at some of that meta thought processes with students, that could be a good way of approaching it and having them think about, okay, so what would it take for me to believe something? What would I trust? And then you can have a conversation. Okay, so if you trust this, maybe you would also trust this. And getting to trust is difficult, and it's something it's really personal to each person. So we have to try to guide students through that in a structured, deliberate way, and hopefully we can get them to be more skeptical than cynical.
Noah is asking, what if the misinformation is shared by someone who has a large platform, like thousands of Twitter followers?
Yeah, so we saw that actually with that fake Donald Trump tweet, was shared by Chelsea Handler, a comedian. She shared that, and it was shared by, it reached a lot of people, and a lot of people shared it. The thing we have to look at with that, though, is that part of it is looking at the source, right? So if it comes from a comedian, right, then that's something that we have to question. If it comes from a political pundit, someone who is known for sharing very strong political viewpoints, right, we have to think about that. And they do share misinformation. Sometimes they share it deliberately. Sometimes it's unknowing. And that can also get us back into some questions of intent, right? If somebody shared it because they were trying to be funny, whereas if they were trying to influence opinion and spread misinformation as a form of propaganda or something, that gets into some questions of intent, because somebody who's sharing it to be funny may acknowledge that they were trying to be funny. They may acknowledge they shouldn't have done it. They made a mistake. Whereas somebody who's hyper partisan and is deliberately trying to share this may not acknowledge it at all. One example I remember a few years ago, we've shared this image before, but there was a photoshopped image of LeBron James where a group called Occupy Democrats had photoshopped a t-shirt he was wearing it to make a stronger political statement. And they shared it on their Facebook page. And as far as I know, it's actually still on their Facebook page. It's been thoroughly debunked time and time again. People have told them that it's a manipulated image, but they won't take it down. And so that actually does tell you something about the nature of that organization and that group, that they put out something. Maybe they didn't know it was manipulated at first, but they certainly know now because people have told them, but they keep it up. And so that can get to some interesting questions about intent. So yeah, I mean, it happens, and sometimes and so we have to think about who it is that has that big platform, why they shared it, and whether or not they acknowledge it in any way when they get called out for it.
Right. Question from Karen. I wanted to use some of the misinformation about the 5G towers to show students how misinformation appeals to their emotions. The rest of the lesson showed examples of different outlets debunking the conspiracy theory relating 5G to COVID-19. However, YouTube has taken down most of the misinformation concerning that theory. While I am encouraged that YouTube took action, what is a teacher to do when she needs an example of misinformation for her lesson? I've run into the same problem over the past 2 years using a clip of Alex Jones demonizing HRC as a witch in conjunction with my Crucible unit.
So one of the tools that might actually come in handy there is called the Internet Archive. Peter is going to go into that next week in terms of how people can use that. But a lot of times people who are doing debunking work and fact-checking work, they'll save those in a web archiver so that you can go back and see it it basically takes a screen recording of it. So there are some tools where you can search for those, and they can be a little complicated to use, but that's actually something that Peter is going to talk about next week in terms of how people archive those and save them for later. But yeah, it can be difficult to find an older example once something has been taken down, especially when the platforms take things down like YouTube and Facebook. We actually saw that recently with the conspiracy theory video called Plandemic. It's being removed from Facebook and YouTube. You can still find it if you know where to look, and I don't actually encourage you to go to some, because there are some of these alternate and fringe other social media and video sharing platforms. So it's out there if you want to find it. But I think the more effective thing could be to sort of use some of the things that fact checkers and debunkers are saving, and we can do that. And that's something we'll talk about next week. We can try to share some of that in the folder if we can find some good resources to share. So we'll try to share some before next week, but we'll definitely go into it next week.
Right, question from Marty. Do you have any suggestions about how to have students practice doing reverse image search? I ask because once a falsified image has been debunked, students' reverse image searches keep finding links to stories debunking it. I would like to create opportunities to practice it on images that haven't already been debunked.
Yeah, that can be tricky because once it has been debunked, and if it's been fact checked by one or more of the fact checking sites, the search results are going to prioritize the fact check in a lot of ways. I think though that one way that you can do it is just practice reverse image searching random images that people share, and being able to sort of see how sometimes an image is easy to find, but sometimes an image is difficult to find. So for example, if you do reverse image searches on news photos, you might find those photos in other news stories and other news sources. But it's really about just sort of practicing how to do it and evaluating the results and recognizing that sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes you got to go really deep in the results to find something. So you might just consider doing it off of random images on social media, and then, unfortunately, depending on your social media feed, eventually something's going to come up that's not real.
All right. The faster we answer, the more they come in. Sorry, give me a second here.
It's okay.
Here's a good question. Christine, from Christine, do you recommend debunking as a private conversation or on social media? Isn't the point to make sure others don't believe as well?
Yeah, I think part of that would be a decision about who shared the misinformation to begin with. I'll be honest that when my friends that I'm connected to on social media, when they share a piece of misinformation, I'm actually more likely to mention it to them privately, through a private message or a text message. But if it's not, but it also depends on the context of where it's shared. Sometimes I might look at the comments to see how many, if other people have already debunked it, or if people are talking about it in some way. But that's kind of a judgment call about how you think that person might react to being called out. If you think they may react badly, you might consider doing it privately. If you think that they would probably be open and you do it and you approach it the right way, if you think they might respond to it favorably, through a public way, it's difficult. It's really a judgment call.
Great. All right. Question from Fabiola de Bolivia. That's awesome. She has a question. As emotions are key in managing disinformation, how can we include emotions management, abilities, and activities when working on news literacy?
That's a really good question, and unfortunately not one that I can give you a clear answer to. That's not something that I really have a lot of experience in teaching. I think that on its face, talking about managing emotions can be a good conversation, but I would wonder, I would want to be careful about the context and the students and the environment of where we have those conversations, because that does get into social emotional learning. I think that there are probably some tools there that we could look into. Miriam, if we can save that one for later, I'll do some checking and see if there's something I can find that would share that might be helpful for that.
Great. Okay. Somebody's asking, do we have a, if we don't have this right now, I'll just answer Paula. Paula's asking for a source for the brain development slide.
Yes, I'll find that source. I'm sorry if it was, I think it's in there. I'll go back and look and send you a source. I believe the source is actually in the graphic, but I will go back and double check, and I'll give you the source for that when we find it.
All right.
Let's take like one or two more, and then we'll close out for and so obviously we cannot get to every question, but here's the thing: is we're going to download all of the questions that people asked. The ones that we didn't get to today, we're going to type out some answers, and we will share the answers to all the questions that we got in the resource folder. We're going to answer those. We'll share that document with you next week. So let's do like one or two more.
Okay. Here's a couple of people have asked this, and the same thing in the last webinar. So John is wondering if it's okay to use these images in their presentations for class.
Yes. I mean, we'll share a PDF of this presentation with you. Feel free to use and adapt what we shared with you. If you think it'll be effective in teaching your students, please, absolutely. That's why we share it with you.
Question from Jennifer. I've used Australia's media literacy curriculum and taught misinformation in 3 classifications: mis, mal, and dis. Is there value to this classification system, or does it matter what classification system is used?
So talking about the difference between misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, that gets to some important distinctions in terms of intent of how and why things are created. Those 3 do have very clear definitions. I didn't really share them in this, but I think that is an important way, because recognizing those differences is an important thing behind intent, about why misinformation, disinformation is created, and some of the purposes of it. So yeah, I think that you talking about those categories is also important, but I think that getting to some of it does help explain about some of the motivations for propagation and sharing.
Mm-hmm. And that this topic kind of relates to Rosalind's earlier question about the difference between misinformation and disinformation, because we speak about it a little differently than first draft, as she mentioned. So.
Yes. I mean, that's the thing. You know, sometimes the terms misinformation and disinformation are used interchangeably, but disinformation is the important distinction about disinformation is that it's false, but it's created intentionally to mislead. Like the person who created it, or whoever created it, like they created it knowing that it was not true, knowing that it was false, and they shared it because they were trying to deliberately mislead people. You know, we see that with often with propaganda, but we also see that in particular with conspiracy theories. So disinformation is more intentional. It was created knowingly false and shared knowingly false. Whereas misinformation has some of those differences where somebody may share it not realizing it's false, and there's different motivations behind it. So yeah, that is an important distinction to make there. And we can probably find something to share in the resource folder with that. Okay, I'm going to close us out. I just want to say thank you so much for spending the time, especially those of you who have held on to the end with the questions. I sincerely hope that you found this to be an effective and informative use of your time. I want to thank Miriam, Susanna, Peter, and Jordan for helping out with this today. I hope that you got some good information from them. Miriam is going to be sending out a follow-up email very soon. As soon as we get the recording process, we're going to upload that to our YouTube channel and Vimeo, and we'll be sharing it on our website. So that will be available very soon. So thank you very much. Miriam?
These slides, we'll get that in the folder, and you'll be receiving an email tomorrow morning with additional information. We had a couple of people ask about a certificate. So for your attendance. Those instructions will be in the email you'll get tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you for joining us.